Hello, welcome everyone. Thank you for joining us for our last installment of the semester for Preservation School. This is the last class, but we have had 3 others. Those are all available on our website, htc.org, and also on our YouTube channel, along with the entire back catalog of our Preservation School classes. Even pre-pandemic, we were recording them, so we have all of them online for you. We'll be having additional virtual tours this coming summer, possibly in-person tours. We are still in the process of trying to decide the logistics of it all, but please do keep checking back, check your emails. We will let you know. Either way, we will do some tours for the summer. Sorry, again. Okay. With that, I will hand it over to Andrea. Thank you.
Okay. Hello, everyone. It's good to see all of you. I think I know a few of you, so it's great to see you again, even virtually. And it's nice to meet all the new people who are interested in the economics of preservation. So I will go ahead and share my screen. So just checking, are you all seeing the presentation?
Yep, we can see it.
Okay, great, thank you. I'm 15 or 16 months in, still learning how all this works. So hello again, I'm Andrea Goldwyn. I'm the Director of Public Policy at the New York Landmarks Conservancy. The Conservancy is a private nonprofit organization that works primarily in New York City. We provide financial and technical assistance to the people who own and use and live in historic buildings, and we advocate for those buildings and those people. Like the historic districts off from the Municipal Art Society in the early 1970s, in 1973 for us, and we were founded just after the Landmarks Commission was established to work sort of in tandem with them doing our financial and technical assistance. In those nearly 50 years, we've loaned and granted over $54 million, which my notes say has leveraged more than $1 billion in 1,850 restoration projects throughout New York. The Conservancy's also offered countless pro bono technical advice to building owners, nonprofits, individuals, and of course, we testify at the Landmarks Commission and various city agencies on preservation issues. As the LPC's 50th anniversary was approaching back in 2015, we thought it was the right time to delve into some of the data issues that have been a struggle sometimes for preservation. We know anecdotally that it's a success. I hope some of you see that in your work. The Landmarks Commission has a long list of neighborhoods that would like to be designated. New York is always at the top of the list for projects that use the federal tax credit. But once again, we were under attack. We were receiving these reports that preservation was limiting jobs, limiting economic growth, limiting housing, and limiting diversity. And there was not a lot of good data about preservation in New York. There was one study that on property values that the city's independent budget office had released in 2003, which we used, but it wasn't up to date. And we really wanted to find out what the facts were about preservation. So the Conservancy retained Place Economics, that's Donovan Ripkema's consulting firm, which focuses on preservation, to produce the report on the left, Historic Preservation at the Core of a Dynamic New York City. That came out in 2016. Donovan's firm works on preservation issues all across the country, and they've done it like this for a few cities, but this is the first one for New York. At the same time, I should note that HDC and the Furman Center were doing reports on preservation, sort of looking toward the LPC's anniversary. HDC had a report on preservation and affordable housing. And the Furman Center had a report on demographics. Place Economics was able to use some of the findings from those reports and incorporate them into their work. All three reports came out around the same time in 2016, and they were presented at a joint panel that year. A few years later, we went back to Place Economics to update the report and to also specifically on commercial properties and jobs in historic districts. The first draft of that report was completed in spring 2020. And so, of course, in the changed world, we spent quite a bit of time thinking about how to make it relevant. The report was released in late summer, almost a year ago. So I'll be talking about the findings from both of these reports, which show that preservation has helped New York thrive for decades and that it will help New York recover from the current economic crisis. Both reports are on the Conservancy's website, which is nylandmarks.org. You have to work your way in a little bit to find them, but I'm happy to help out with that if you're looking for them. So some of the information is from the original that I'm going to share is from the original report. Some of it is from the second report. They overlapped but had slightly different focuses. And honestly, some of the graphics from the different reports worked better than others. So I tried to pull out the images that tell the best story about this field. So here's the executive summary. And what we were looking to do was to respond to some of the attacks and to put out some of the really strong benefits of preservation. So some things I'll be talking about are kind of with responding to kind of an imaginary critique, and some of them are being more proactive and talking about what's great about preservation. So let's get into it. So the executive summary here shows that despite kind of the attention that a lot of people paid to preservation and presenting it as kind of causing a lot of problems, less than 5% of the lot area in New York City is under LPC purview. Despite what people say about how difficult the Landmarks Commission is, they get about 13,000 applications a year, 95% are resolved at staff level, and almost none are denied. The density issue comes up a lot. There is I think a myth that historic districts are not pulling their weight and that we need to upzone them so they can be more dense. But the fact is historic districts are the densest neighborhoods in every borough. And there's also a myth that historic districts overall are frankly richer and whiter than the rest of the city. And while that is true in Manhattan, it is much less true in the other boroughs. Preservation provides jobs, over 9,000 jobs a year in preservation construction activity. $800 million is invested, and that includes $500 million in paychecks. Preservation is at the heart of heritage tourism. A domestic section, people coming from across the country, has provided, and we'll see if it does again, 130,000 jobs. And preservation provides stability. While the construction industry as a whole jumped up and down over the last few crises, preservation has remained relatively stable. And so here are some of what we think will make preservation essential for moving forward in the recovery. 8.4 jobs are in historic districts. They are the location of choice for a wide range of businesses, including the high-tech sector, arts and entertainment, businesses owned by women and minorities, retail, restaurants, other small businesses prefer historic districts. Younger workers are likely to have jobs in historic districts. And here's something I think we were happy to get the numbers on. Older and historic buildings are much more efficient users of energy than recent buildings. The greenest building really is the one already built. Excuse me. All right. Going through, this is from our first report, and the map is a little hard to read, but I think that's almost part of the story it's telling. Back in 2016, 3.4% of all New York City lots were designated. So those are those tiny colored dots all throughout the map. Here it is in a chart form. In the Bronx, it's 1%, Brooklyn 4.5%, Manhattan is 27%, but I think what we try to talk about over and over is that historic districts are Manhattan, but they're more than just Manhattan. In Queens, just 1.2%. Unfortunately, very few districts in Staten Island. And in New York overall, just 3.4%. There's a little bit of a difference between the number of lots and the lot area. And that's why you see the different numbers and why we generally say that under 5%, just so we're covering all the bases. And here is a graphic way of looking at it. The green box are what is not regulated by the Landmarks Commission, and the little blue lines are what is regulated. On the left, that's for all of New York City. On the right, it's just for Manhattan. The sort of lighter blue in the middle is individual landmarks. So once again, despite the idea that preservation is responsible for everything that happens, that historic districts are causing all kinds of problems, they are not. They are making a great contribution and with a pretty small footprint. In our updated report, that went up to 3.8%. So that is as of last year, 2018, I believe. Here's another way of looking at it, and you see that the numbers hold. The commission is still designating, the numbers are growing very, very slightly, but overall, well under 5% of New York City is designated. And then there's the question of dealing with the Landmarks Commission. People sometimes have issues dealing with LPC with their applications. At the Conservancy, we work with a lot of, we get phone calls from people who are having these problems. And here you can see 95% of applications are handled by the staff. A small number, 5%, go to a public hearing. And every year, just around 90%, sometimes a little bit less, sometimes a little bit more, project applications are approved. You can barely even see these small blue lines in each bar of applications that are denied. So moving on. Now we're going to get into the issues. We hear that, as I said, that historic districts are not dense enough, that they don't have enough people living in them, that in order to solve the affordable housing crisis, we need to build across our historic districts. So we need to upzone them. And here you can see on the map, and apologies that it's not very clear, this is a good reason for you to go check out the report. But the vast number of areas of low density, and that is the green, the yellowish green, are not where there are historic districts. The high density areas, the darker blue and red color, which often overlap with historic districts, those are the places where New York is dense. Far from preventing density, New York's historic districts are adding significantly, with more than 2/3 being high density or very high density. Here you can see the density overall in New York by square mile is in the dark blue. The green is residential areas that are not designated. And then the yellow is historic districts. So all across the city, in every borough, historic districts are more dense than the borough overall. Another way of displaying that in this upper pie chart, the the share of low density districts is just about 1% of within historic districts is just about 1%. So when you're looking at low density areas, only 1% of historic districts overlap with them. And in fact, almost 93% of historic districts are greater than the citywide average for density. So that argument, which we hear over and over again, just doesn't make any sense. And the corollary of that is that you need to have skyscrapers in order to create housing and increase density. And here is another graphic which shows that in non-historic residential areas, it's about 80,000 people, almost 81,000 people per square mile. In skyscrapers, because even though they're taller, the new buildings tend to have larger apartments. It's 105,000 per square mile. But in historic districts, it's almost 145,000 per square mile. So any way you look at it, historic districts are dense. They are doing their part to provide housing for New Yorkers. And then looking just at skyscrapers in general, the idea that when you build skyscrapers, you increase density, you increase diversity, racial and ethnic diversity, and income diversity. And what we found is that essentially that is not true. Here you can see, Donovan and his team selected a group of skyscrapers built between 2000 and 2014. This isn't connected to historic districts. There weren't any districts in these areas, but it's just looking what are the impacts of skyscrapers. And what they found was that from 2000 to 2014, the blocks that had new skyscrapers the diversity did not change that much, that there were a little bit less white, there were a little bit fewer Black residents, more Asian and more other. And they're using census data, so it's not always as fine-tuned as we might like, but that's the data that's available. And then the income disparities actually get even worse. Before the skyscrapers were built, these blocks had larger percentages of residents making under $50,000 and smaller percentage making over 150. And with the skyscrapers, that flips. You have fewer residents making 50,000 and more making over 150,000. So what that tells us put together is that upzoning upzoning is not the answer, that historic districts are already providing a dense, diverse community. All right, and let's get into the demographics and housing issues a bit. Oh, excuse me. All right. Let my notes catch up with the presentation. And here we are. So what Donovan's numbers found is that New York is a diverse community. New York's historic districts are diverse racially, ethnically, and economically. About half the people who live in historic districts live in Manhattan. About 30% live in Brooklyn, 9% in Queens, 4% in the Bronx, and 1% in Staten Island. When you look at the changes in population in historic districts from 2010 to 2017, the numbers across the city are a bit lower for historic districts than this. But when you look at them borough by borough, in some cases, the population in historic districts grows. In the Bronx, in Brooklyn, and in Staten Island, and especially Staten Island, the change in population was all substantially more in historic districts. And here you can see more of that. I hope you can see these graphics. I apologize for the quality here. The historic districts often take the rep that they are primarily for white residents and that they're not open to non-white residents. And you can see that while New York overall, the non-white population is at 60%, it's historic districts that is really skewed by Manhattan. In the Bronx, that flips. In Staten Island, that flips. And Brooklyn and Queens, it's a little bit more in the middle. And in each decade that the LPC has been designating buildings, the proportion of majority white and majority minority it's ebbed and flowed, but I think we're in a progression where we're seeing more areas that are not majority white being designated. And I think certainly the most recent designations would bear that out. One of the really interesting findings was that the growth of the Hispanic population, and again, that's a census word, in historic districts was much greater than in the rest of the city. The growth was by 7% in the city overall and by 11% in historic districts. And you see that especially in the Bronx, in Queens, and in Staten Island. Let's see. Financially, the demographics on household income show the same kind of diversity. The historic districts are the dark blue, and so in Brooklyn and Manhattan, there are more residents who make over $150,000. In the Bronx, in Queens, and in Staten Island, there are more residents that make less than $50,000. So what we've tried to do overall is take some of the myths about preservation and historic districts and show that districts overall really reflect the city as a whole. And here the income distribution is broken down a lot more. These darker blue numbers are below $25,000. Then the middle income is the greens and the yellows. And then this darker, I think it's black, shows income above $200,000. But it really skews Manhattan. If you take Manhattan out of the mix, you see it is a much more well-rounded kind of diversity where you've got more people at the lower end and the middle end and many fewer at the upper end. When it comes to affordable housing specifically, as I said, our report came out at just around the same time as HDC's report. So we referred back to them on a number of issues, but I think their overall findings, and I'm sure Michelle can provide a link to that report, was that designation did not significantly impact affordable housing in districts, that rental prices didn't increase substantially, affordable housing subsidies were maintained, and there was a robust number of units developed even after the districts were designated. And here's an issue that for such a long time was so critical to the discussion on preservation and really did not have as much of an impact. We don't hear people questioning this nearly as much as we used to, but what is the impact of designation on property values? And here, as I said, the Furman Center did some work at around the same time, updated what the IBO had done. And what you see is that the changes in historic districts, except Brooklyn is an outlier at the time that Furman was looking at, which I think was in the 2010s, that the disparity was pretty similar in the Bronx, that the changes in Brooklyn were much higher in historic districts, but much lower in Manhattan, similar in Queens, a little bit higher in Staten Island. So once again, historic districts have had some impact on property values. They stabilize property values. They tend to have a halo effect and affect the areas right outside the district boundaries in ways just as much as within the districts. All right, so that's what preservation, that's what some of the facts about historic districts. So let's find out they do. They attract visitors. So preservation and is tied to heritage tourism, which brings in some $8 billion, $8 billion a year. 31% of day visitors, almost 40% of overnight visitors are coming to see our historic properties and coming here for heritage tourism. Now, obviously, a lot of this is before COVID, and we're going to see how things pan out going forward. But the sites and the attraction to see them and the pull of the history is just as great as ever. Continue to be a great draw. Heritage tourism creates 130,000 jobs a year and over $700 million in revenue. It has. People are spending hundreds of dollars per person on lodging, transportation, food, beverages, and recreation when they come to New York to see the sites, the heritage tourism related sites. Moving to the next section. What does preservation mean in terms of job creation? And here you can see that from 2007 to 2015, historic district activity, that's the green line, remained pretty constant. This dip was the 2008 recession, but where the overall construction industry has deeper dips and higher highs, preservation remains an ongoing source of job creation. Preservation creates about 9,000 jobs a year, and that is over $500 million in wages and salary. All right, so I put this in, and you can go take a look at it in the report, but we asked Donovan to look at whether businesses wanted to be in historic districts. And so this chart is a breakdown of industry data where different sections of the city are categorized as high preservation. And in this, we've got Chelsea, downtown Brooklyn, Greenwich Village, moderate preservation, this middle area that includes City Hall, Upper East Side, and then low intensity preservation areas in the Bronx, Queens, and Brooklyn. And it's organized by what percentage of these areas as categorized by CoStar have historic districts. So with that in mind, these numbers show that here, the office vacancy rate, here's high intensity preservation. That's just about the lowest, lower than these other preservation activity areas, lower than the city overall, and lower than the national average. Over here, you flip it, the market rent and the off-market price, in both of those, the high intensity preservation is a little bit lower than the medium intensity preservation, which is the highest. And so what this shows us is that preservation is attractive to businesses. They want to be in historic districts. We hear a lot about how preservation and LPC regulation are slowing business down, but we're just not seeing that. And the same thing with retail. The retail vacancy rate, and this is all pre-COVID, was higher in the high intensity preservation, but fairly low in the other preservation categories. The rents and the pricing, once again, very high. So preservation, historic districts, excuse me, my notes and my slides are not aligning. So apologies for that. For retail, preservation and historic districts are the places to be. Overall in Manhattan, historic districts contain 8% of businesses, but that's 10% of restaurants, 11% of retail, and 17% of businesses in arts, entertainment, or recreation. The creative industries want to be in historic districts. These dark blue show historic districts, for the rest of New York in the information industries, professional, scientific, and technical services, arts, entertainment, and recreation. In each of those, historic districts are the place of choice for these businesses. They contain 10% of professional scientific jobs, 13% of information jobs, 20% of arts. Right, and then the creative industries. The creative class, younger workers are attracted to working in historic districts. 30% of workers 29 or younger in Manhattan were in historic districts compared to 24% in the rest of the borough. Creative jobs in Manhattan in historic districts are higher. That's the turquoise. Compared to the rest of New York, that's green. That's all creative jobs. And then there's arts, entertainment, and recreation. So this is really showing more of the same for the types of smaller businesses, for women and minority-owned businesses, for younger workers overall across the city. Historic districts are where people want to be working, where people want to have their businesses, where they think they can be successful. And again, these trends just show again that in retail, restaurants, arts and entertainment, all very difficult businesses on very tight margins, preservation, the difference. And that's why we think that these are the places where people will be coming back in the recovery. They provide a diversity of location, of business, of building, office type, business type that is going to be very powerful if and when people start coming back to the office. And then of course there are the tech jobs. Tech companies love historic buildings. We go into a little bit more detail on the big tech companies, but Apple, Amazon, Netflix, Google, and Facebook were all leasing large spaces for their offices in New York. They like these older loft buildings. They provide the kind of large open air spaces with a lot of light that brings in some of that Silicon Valley feel, but in the heart of the city. All right, so we'll just back that up by one. I think we can say overall that preservation and historic districts are providing the right atmosphere for small businesses, for creative businesses, for tech businesses that are going to be essential as New York goes forward. All right, and here's something, another great thing about historic districts, their impact on the environment. So as some of you might know, the city in its system, let's say local law 84 to track and quantify energy and water consumption throughout the city. As part of that, in 2017, we can see that the buildings in this dark blue section of the pie are from after 1980. The turquoise is mid-century and later, and the green and the yellow are pre-1950 buildings, so more than half. But in this chart, you see that those buildings are using up substantially less energy. Energy use intensity is what it's called. Residential buildings and in offices. It's really quite astonishing. Pre-1920 is about almost 11 or 12% of post-1980. And again, the historic buildings in historic districts are using much less energy than buildings outside historic districts. This is for all building types. And this is for multifamily buildings and office buildings. So in historic districts, these two over here are very low. Outside of historic districts, they're very high. The Energy Star rating, overall, New York doesn't have the best Energy Star ratings, but their counterparts. And just as a reminder, the federal tax credits, New York is one of the biggest users of the tax credits. This shows that most of them are slightly more than half are in Manhattan, but they're also in Brooklyn and the other boroughs. And finally, we tried to do a little bit of like a Freakonomics style survey to just capture some of the intangibles about historic districts. What did New Yorkers, what's important to New Yorkers? That's the way it was presented. I don't think it was presented in a historic buildings context because we didn't want to skew the data. But when we asked people what's important, what's not important, attractive buildings and public spaces, interesting streets and buildings, presence of historic and other important buildings. And down here, presence of recently constructed high rises, not so important. Over here, if there were no financial or other constraints, what kind of neighborhood would you want to live in? 51% say largely historic district. So overall, what we found is that historic districts have an attraction to people who aren't thinking about all of these specifics. They just like these old buildings. And if you could live in any type of building, what would it be? By, whoops, a vast majority, single family brownstone. All right, so gathering up all of this information, what do we think historic districts, what is preservation going to do for the recovery? It's going to support the reopening and recovery of small businesses, generate labor-intensive jobs that stay even throughout up and down crises, retain high-tech businesses, bring in tourists, provide venues for arts and culture, maintain extraordinary density, but at a human scale, prioritize development that is long-term, sustainable, and responsible. And then the intangible, retain the places that serve as the touchstone of what cities of New Yorkers. The conclusion just kind of wraps up everything I've been talking about. And I think Donovan said it really well. Far from being a deterrent to growth or a hamper on development or a plot to freeze the city in amber, historic buildings and neighborhoods are at the center of a dynamic, growing, and diverse New York. Historic buildings may have been built throughout the centuries, but they are meeting the needs of businesses, institutions, and residents in the 21st century. So that is all of our findings. We have sent out the reports back in 2016 and then again this year to all of our elected officials and people running for office. And we will be meeting with them again going forward once we find out who's actually won the race this year. So that is the report, and I'm happy to answer any questions. I will stop the share, and please let me know what your reactions are. If you have any questions, want any specifics, happy to talk about it for a few minutes.
Hi, Andrea, it's George. That was great. Hi,
oh,
that was fantastic. We should all memorize your entire preservation as a presentation, as I'm sure you have. Just a question. I mean, I know you're not going to go back and do the research, and I don't think you should, but it should be noted in some content, and if you could redo the research, that would be great. But this doesn't include individual landmarks. So I'm thinking of little things like the Empire State Building, the Chrysler Building, the Starrett Lehigh Building. So, you know, even if you can't go back and redo all of the research, but it touches on many of the points that these are hundreds and thousands of tech firms and law firms and creative firms. And it would be great to at least reflect it, you know, at least say that we're only talking about historic districts. Can you comment on that?
Yeah, you know, I think one of the problems that we've had to face as a field, and it's not unique to preservation, but the data isn't great. And I think what Donovan was able to do was really pull out the most complete data about historic districts. There are a few places in there where he does talk about individual landmarks, and there are a few places where he specifically doesn't. I think in some of the jobs numbers, he's saying even without you know, the Empire State Building, historic buildings in districts are still, you know, the venue of choice for so many people. But it's a great point, and you know,
and maybe just work it into the presentation to Eric Adams or whomever. Say, please bear in mind, this does not include the Chrysler Building or the Empire State Building,
or Catherine Garcia. I just read hot off the presses before we came on that the newest numbers narrowed the race a lot. So. Probably Eric Adams, but whoever it is, we'll be talking to them. Great. Yeah,
because they don't think of that. They think of they don't know what an historic district is. So thank you so much.
They don't. Thanks so much, George. Always.
Here's a question.
Susan?
If historic districts maintain and increase the property values, how can they be centers for affordable housing?
You know, I think that there is a lot of, there's been a lot of data over the years on property values and historic districts. And what they tend to do is maintain the property values, as I said, have this halo effect around the districts, but they also keep affordable units in their buildings when areas are not designated. From what I understand, and I'm hardly an affordable housing or tenants' rights expert, one of the few ways that tenants can turn out, that landlords can turn out their tenants these days with the changes to rent regulation and in the past few years is to demolish their buildings. And so one of the things that historic districts can do is protect those buildings. But I think it's also fair to point out that that designation is separate from use. And so I think it's important for all of us to, you know, work more to help make, you know, ownership more manageable, more affordable. But technically, designation does not prescribe how a building can be used. Although in a practical sense, we know that the two things do have a connection. And for what it's worth, there is also a low income tax credit, which is often paired with a historic tax credit. We just saw some projects recently. We got a new project on the grounds of a church in the Bronx that is using the low income tax credit to build new affordable housing on their grounds. So we find places where it works together. Robert.
Oh, hi, I just want to point out one thing that qualitatively that districts are very different from one another. So you could take a district like Soho, where they were basically derelict industrial buildings where, like, you know, one after another was going out of business. And preservationists identified that as being something that was of immense value many years before the rest of the world saw it. So, you know, when the rest of the world caught up and it became one of the most expensive, you know, maybe neighborhoods in the world, it's hard to say, it's hard to evaluate that. You know, you can't compare that to like a brownstone neighborhood where it's a residential neighborhood, you know, how that changes after it's designated. Because it's, you know, it puts a spin on it, because it's not a, you know, if you just extract the numbers, they don't represent qualitatively what happens.
Yeah, I think that also not an economist, but it's true. I mean, every district is a little bit different. Soho is kind of an extreme example of being different from other districts, but I don't know that that disqualifies the numbers that we're talking about just because, you know, Soho was different. And I don't know if it's one of the most expensive neighborhoods. There are a lot of expensive apartments. There are a lot of rent regulated and otherwise regulated apartments. So it's a real mix.
But I wouldn't necessarily attribute that to historic preservation. It's just maybe when people recognize that it was a great neighborhood, you know, it was really market economics that made it, you know, expensive. I'm just saying that you know, the fact that preservationists can identify things that are of value before the rest of the world doesn't mean that they're causing values to be inflated because they're preserved.
Yeah, absolutely.
I'm not spinning it negatively towards preservation, but there are a number of sort of industrial areas that have been preserved and then become super hip neighborhoods.
Yeah, no, I think what artists found in Soho and Tribeca and other neighborhood, and, you know, West Chelsea, Meatpacking, all of those neighborhoods, you know, residents found these underused buildings, revitalized them, and historic district designation came on a little bit later than that, but that's kind of helped maintain it. But yeah, I think that's a great thing to point out. And another one of those like slightly intangible things that we'd love to find a way to quantify, because people seem to love numbers. Or we have sidebar reports too. We can have more sidebars in the next version. Yes. Susan.
Hi. That was a wonderful report. And I was just talking with George recently about the fact that the governor has declared blighted the area around Penn Station.
Yeah, that's bad.
A number of advocacy groups are working towards calling attention to the historic buildings. But I'm wondering if, taking a different angle, for example, the information in this report could be used to reimagine something different from what Vornado is proposing, which is to raise everything and put up glass office towers. So I'm just wondering to what extent the report you have, which is very comprehensive, could be used by advocates to broaden the argument, or to say, let's think about what rezoning could look like. Let's think about all the ways to put money into preserving certain things to enhance the economic benefits. Do you see that as a strategy?
Yeah, I mean, I think that this plan, the Empire Station Complex plan, is so off base in so many different ways. Just kind of when you think about, excuse me, Facebook, you know, leasing huge amounts of office space in the old post office building right next door, it doesn't, it's baffling. Like, no one seems to have any words for it. But I think that's a great point, that there are some really vibrant, exciting historic buildings in that neighborhood, and finding ways to reuse them and make them more attractive. And, you know, if that can help, if there can be some value capture from that helps get us a new Penn Station, I think that would really be a win. So we are, the Conservancy and all of the other groups are kind of talking about this all the time, waiting to see what happens next with the governor, and happy to help in that effort any way we can.
What about reimagining, like rather than waiting for the governor, making proposals that would reimagine, sort of, take action and say, how about this as an example of reimagining the area? I was thinking the other day, well, what about, different specific proposals of how this would all be integrated with newer and older buildings? I mean, Vornado owns the Chicago Merchandise Mart, a gigantic building, and they completely environmentally appropriate and all kinds of other things. And it was a mess and an eyesore, and they chose to do it. I don't know what pressures were on them in Chicago. Chicago's a totally different city than New York City. I speak as a Midwesterner, and it really is. People seem to be more sensible there about architecture, but
they love their architecture maybe more than we do. I hate to say it, but they might.
They might what?
I think they really love and identify with their architecture in a broader way than I think New Yorkers do. Not the New Yorkers on this Zoom, because obviously, but architecture is much more kind of in the way that Chicagoans think about themselves, from what I understand. But I think, those are great points. And, I think there are groups working on it. And it sounds like, I'll take this back to Peg and we can talk about it. But I hope that you're sharing your thoughts with some of the other groups too, because it's going to take a really strong effort and a vocal effort to push back this proposal.
Okay, we'll follow up with you.
Great.
George, yes?
I'm sure George will follow. I have no doubt George will follow up.
Absolutely. And Andrea, will the Conservancy lead that? I mean, I don't want to take all the air, oxygen out of it, but I'm just interested in you say that all the preservation groups are talking about this all the time. I haven't seen a leader in the preservation movement specifically about the Empire District proposal. And I don't want to put you on the spot either, but it would be great to have a collective. Is there a collective about this, for example?
The preservation groups talk on a regular basis, and it's certainly one of the things that we are all keeping an eye on. We're all talking with the community board. I know there are kind of hyper-local groups talking about this. So we are, it's on our focus. You're not putting me on the spot, but I'm not sure that I can add a whole lot more to it right now. Sure. Any other questions? Non-Empire Station Complex, although that's certainly a big bonanza.
There is one that says, related to Susan's question, have you considered a study of the economic effects of non-designation on older commercial districts where properties have been deliberately neglected or abandoned for decades in anticipation of redevelopment?
Yeah, I mean, I think that is a really interesting topic. I mean, a million years ago in grad school, I did some research on demolition by neglect, which is sort of a much was on a much smaller scale than what we're talking about here. Honestly, I wonder if that might not be a great topic for someone. And I only say that because for an economic study, you need to be able to classify things in some way. And I'm happy to talk to Donovan and see if that's the kind of thing he can do. But unless you're looking at it neighborhood by neighborhood, like the garment district, I'm not sure how you design that report, but it's certainly an important topic. And I think it's worth pointing out that there are a lot of buildings that might not be locally designated, but they're either on the National Register, in National Register districts, or eligible for listing on the National Register. There are a bunch of those around Empire Station, which does provide a little bit more of a hook for, you know, getting into it, and as we're fighting this one.
Here in Stamford, Connecticut, we have developers who specialize in demolition by neglect.
Sure. Yeah. I think it's a long game, but they often seem willing to play it. But so do we. So we'll do what we can. Any other questions?
Laura, you did have your hand up. Do you still have a question?
I did. Some of it has been discussed already because I'm not a professional in this field. I did chair the Land Use Committee for Community Board 2 in the 1990s. I live in Soho, and I've been very involved in the whole issue
Yes.
of the upzoning and all of that.
Yeah.
It's a funny thing to say this in terms of preservation, but I think looking back, the 74-711, which allowed buildings to have use changes and size changes outside the allowed envelope in exchange for fixing the facade theoretically in perpetuity, which doesn't always happen, was very bad for Soho in some ways, because economically what it did was bring in and gentrify the area much more. I'm assuming that we artists are not gentrified, of course, to some extent, but
the whole topic of gentrification is so interesting, because in the 70s, when there was a lot of disinvestment, gentrification was a positive, desirable thing.
Right.
And we've kind of gotten ahead of ourselves in a lot of ways. And things like 74-711 might have something to do with that. And that would be another really interesting thesis topic, because my impression was that it was designed to encourage preservation.
That's right.
To put money, that the point of it was to get buildings renovated. But at some point it kind of shifted, and the renovation became the tail that the dog wagged, whatever it is, it flipped.
It did. You can take the building in Soho on Broadway where Uniqlo now is. They got a 74-711. They did not do the repairs and changes they said they would. They moved Uniqlo in on the ground floor. Uniqlo, they were supposed to have joint live work quarters for artists on the second floor, but Uniqlo occupies the second floor, and now they just bought the whole building. And one wonders what's going to happen to the people who live in the building.
And ironically, the rezoning, when it first was under discussion, the idea was to kind of help conform the zoning to the actual uses.
That's right. And now it's far beyond. The whole idea was restriction on big box to somehow have a way for the illegal non-artist residents to become legalized, to open it up to more creator kind of fields. And that was the whole concept. And suddenly it's become a whole political hot potato is what it's become.
It certainly has.
We struggle to figure, but one of the things that I found very fascinating in this is one of the arguments we've been given is that we've been talking about creative reuse of some of the buildings to build affordable housing, to take away the restriction. Right now, you can't have a residence built in Soho that's under, I think, 1,100 or 1,200 square feet. You can change that too. You can do creative reuse into building genuinely affordable housing within the envelopes that we have now. These buildings can be done that way. It's hard because they're narrow and no windows to a lot of them, but a lot of them will work. Corner buildings that will work. But that's that's not even a consideration at this point.
Yeah, we've referred back to some of the other groups'
Yeah.
reports that talk about other ways to create affordable housing and absolutely support those concepts.
And of course there is. I mean, the block I live on, and I'm in, is more than 50% Asian owned or Asian occupied. So
yeah, that's
another aspect of it. But the going back is one of the arguments that we have been hearing from those who want the new buildings built, is that they're much more environmentally sound.
Impossible.
And what you're saying is, and I keep repeating back, like, glass is reflective. It heats the environment. I mean, I'm an amateur and I know that stuff, you know, and so we need arguments like that work, that can go back to these very pro atrocities that's going to destroy something that's a tourist attraction, that has a lot of small boutiques and other types of business that will be driven out. So it's a use thing, and it's also a preservation thing. We were very happy in my building when they expanded the Soho cast iron historic district, because then we were within the purview of it since 2010.
2010, yep.
And see, I even know my dates. So, and yet we're often being told, well, you're not really in Soho.
Oh, you are. You know you are.
Oh, I know. I know. Yeah. Gosh, I know this. I know every street because of zoning, you know, but it's been a real issue in terms of showing the economics of preservation here for Soho. And as was mentioned, we are unusual. We're not a long, stable community. We've actually been a very unstable community even after the artists moved in. And largely because the rules that were set up in the zoning were never followed.
Yeah, no, and again, the intention was to improve the zoning, but we've certainly ended up in a very different place. I think the community board is still having their hearings.
Yes.
And then it'll keep going through ULURP, and it'll be really interesting to see what happens in the fall when perhaps the new council member elect is against it and the council member in place is for it. So yeah, well, it's a really interesting dynamic. Does anyone else have any other questions or topics? And thanks, Allison.
I've got a quick question.
Sure.
Can you think of some unintended consequences of at least the impact on historic preservation with the great glut of all of these commercial spaces that are sitting unavailable? You know, as try to get, I've just been thinking about that. How is that going to impact, the rest of the city? And I'm just wondering if you just anticipate that having some impact we hadn't yet thought about or anticipated.
Yeah, there might be a shakeout of, market, of office market pricing that might benefit like the Class B and Class C buildings that are often the older historic buildings. It might make space more available to, nonprofits and arts groups. And so I think there are potential benefits. Preservation really came of age in the 70s when the city was in a very dark place, different from this dark place, but people really turned to their historic buildings as a source of, comfort and delight, and the economics kind of followed and, helped bring the city back. So we certainly, hope that will happen again. But I think that's a great question to think about, the unintended consequences.
Right.
I think we're still in the middle of it right now, but it's a good thing to start thinking about.
Thank you for an excellent presentation.
Oh, thank you so much. Thank you so much. I loved working on the reports, so it was, it was great to present them.
So many fantastic nuggets in there.
There really are. There really are. We tried to approach it from a few different angles to, you know, make it informative, but also compelling.
Is there, I noticed that one of your numbers there said that the number of women-owned businesses were greater, and that's just fascinating.
Yeah, I think it comes in with the whole idea that historic buildings present a range of different kind of building and office options, that there are smaller spaces, more diverse spaces, and that kind of ends up appealing to, you know, I don't know, to women in particular, but just to kind of, you know, the array of businesses that are not just kind of like big corporations and international investors.
The human scale.
I was just going to say it's a more human kind of interaction. Exactly. Yeah, we were surprised and delighted to see that also.
That seems like that would be a great get to use for galvanizing some more supporters.
We're always trying. But thank you. Tell your friends.
Yeah.
Okay.
All right.
Oh, sorry.
No, it seems like that's everyone. And like I said, you can find the reports on our website, or you can email me and ask me more questions. I can put my email in the chat if anyone needs it. I'll just put it in the chat.
Great.
I also put our report and our infographic in the chat, and the petition for Empire Station Complex for the buildings, and our webpage on it if you want additional information. And if anyone didn't get any of that, you can also email me and I can send it to you. But thank you so much, Andrea. This was fantastic. Once again, we have recorded it, so it will be on our website and on our YouTube, and you can watch all of the previous preservation schools. And I think I'll say goodnight. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.